democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. New details have emerged on how the American Psychological Association, the world's largest group of psychologists, aided government-sanctioned torture under President George W. Bush. A group of dissident psychologists have just published a 60-page report alleging the APA secretly coordinated with officials from the CIA, White House, and the Pentagon to change the APA ethics policy to align it with the operational needs of the CIA's torture program. The report also reveals a behavioral science researcher working for President Bush secretly drafted language that the APA inserted into its ethics policy on interrogations. Much of the report is based on hundreds of newly released internal APA emails from 2003 to 2006 that show top officials were in direct communication with the CIA. In 2004, for example, the APA secretly took part in a meeting with officials from the CIA and other intelligence agencies to discuss ethics and national security. In one email, the APA stated that the aim of the meeting was, quote, to take a forward-looking, positive approach in which we convey a sensitivity to and appreciation of the important work mental health professionals are doing in the national security arena, and in a supportive way offer our assistance in helping them navigate through thorny ethical dilemmas, unquote. One attendee was Kirk Hubbard, then the chief of operations for the CIA Operational Assessment Division. He would later leave the CIA to work for the private firm set up by James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, the psychologists who were hired as private contractors to set up the CIA interrogation program, including the waterboarding of prisoners. In one 2003 email, Hubbard wrote to a top APA official, quote, "You won't get any feedback from Dr. James Mitchell or Jessen. They're doing special things to special people in special places and generally are not available," unquote. While the APA has attempted to distance itself from Mitchell and Jessen, the newly disclosed emails show the men attended a 2003 invite-only conference called The Science of Deception, sponsored by the APA, the CIA, and RAND Corporation to discuss so-called enhanced interrogations. We're joined now by two of the co-authors of the new report, All the President's Psychologists, the American Psychological Association's secret complicity with the White House and U.S. intelligence community in support of the CIA's enhanced interrogation program. Stephen Reisner is clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst. He's a founding member of the Coalition for an Ethical Psychology, an advisor on psychology and ethics for Physicians for Human Rights. He's currently a member of the APA Council of Representatives. Nathaniel Raymond is director of the Signal Program on Human Security and Technology at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. We did invite a representative from the APA to join us as well, but they declined. Last year, the APA commissioned an outside attorney named David Hoffman to conduct a third-party independent review of the allegations about the APA and the Bush administration torture program. Rhea Farberman, the APA's executive director for public and member communications, told Democracy Now! The APA won't respond to the allegations in the All the President's Psychologists report until Hoffman's review is completed. Stephen Reisner and Nathaniel Raymond, welcome back to Democracy Now! Okay, Nathaniel Raymond, why don't you lay out the core findings in your 60-page report?
There are four core findings. The first is that the American Psychological Association allowed, as you mentioned, Dr. Susan Brandon, it appears, who 3 weeks before the APA engaged in its ethics process in 2005 on psychological ethics and national security, had been President Bush's behavioral science advisor. She wrote what appears to be research language in the Penn's report, the Psychological Ethics and National Security Policy of the APA. That language, we now know, because of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report, directly aligns with the legal memos authorizing the enhanced interrogation program and provided an ethical get-out-jail-free card that aligned with the then classified legal get-out-jail-free card. Secondly, we see clear deception by the APA, including some outright lies, including the assertion for many years that James Mitchell, the CIA torture psychologist you mentioned, had not been an APA member. We now know he was an APA member from 2001 to 2006, and the APA has also contended, according to Dr. Stephen Benke, the ethics director, that they had had no contact on interrogations and interrogation techniques with Mitchell and Jessen. We now know that they discussed sensory overload and the use of psychopharmacological agents with Mitchell and Jessen in 2003. The last two critical findings, Amy, are that the APA, as we see throughout the emails, expressed no concern about clear evidence of abuse that at that point, between 2004 and 2005, was public knowledge. And lastly, what we see in this report is a clear coordination that directly mirrors the timeline inside the Bush administration when Office of Medical Services personnel inside the CIA were raising concerns about human subjects research as part of the program. The APA, whether they knew it or not, allowed the administration to write a policy that basically helped put down that rebellion inside CIA.
How? By
allowing psychologists to play a critical monitoring and research role that was at the heart of the then newly authorized Bradbury Office of Legal Counsel memo. If psychologists couldn't ethically play this role, if the APA had not engaged in this policy, it is highly likely that the interrogation program itself would have disintegrated.
You ran Stephen Reisner for president of the American Psychological Association. Your main platform was speaking out against torture and APA's involvement with the Bush administration. You didn't win. Talk about what this means for the American Psychological Association.
Well, I think the issue is what this means for the entire profession of psychologists and the fact that we are represented by the American Psychological Association. Because I think that what we're finding is that psychologists are feeling betrayed by our association. What has happened is that the ethics code that we are all trained in, that we align ourselves with, and that gives us our identity as health professionals dedicated to the public good, that ethics code and ethics policy was twisted to align, not only to align with what the government needed it to do, but in the service of torture. It is a betrayal of what I think we all are expecting from and try to identify with from our association. So what has to happen right now is that we've got to, the membership, the council, any concerned American has to insist that we reclaim our association, put it back on an ethical track, and find a way to expose this, be accountable for it, be transparent about it, and make significant change so that we can restore trust.
We're going to go into detail on what the APA knew and when they knew it with Dr. Stephen Reisner and Nathaniel Raymond, co-authors of the new report, All the President's Psychologists, in a minute. In the Peace Report, we're talking about a new report that has just come out on the American Psychological Association's involvement with the Bush administration's so-called enhanced interrogation program. In 2005, Stephen Benke, the director of ethics at the American Psychological Association, then and now, appeared on Democracy Now!
I don't have firsthand knowledge of what went on at Guantanamo. I know that the APA very much wants the facts, and that when APA has the facts, we will act on those facts.
Stephen Benke appeared on the show in a debate with Michael Wilkes, chair of the Medical Ethics Committee at the British Medical Association. Dr. Benke went on to defend the APA's actions.
In all fairness, the American Psychological Association is very clear that under no circumstances is it in any manner permissible for a psychologist to engage in, to support, to facilitate, to direct, or to advise torture or other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. The American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association issued a joint statement against torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment in 1985. In 1986, the American Psychological Association issued another resolution against torture. So to even suggest that that would in any manner be permissible is completely out of bounds.
Might I ask a direct question, because I'm really interested to know. Could I ask why the APA's presidential report then specifically recommends that psychologists should be involved in research into interrogation techniques?
Well, as I've said, psychologists have been working together with law enforcement for many years domestically in information gathering and interrogation processes. We believe that as experts in human behavior, psychologists have valuable contributions to make to those activities.
That's Dr. Stephen Benke on Democracy Now! In 2005. Our guests now are Dr. Stephen Reisner, member of the American Psychological Association, and Nathaniel Raymond. They both co-authored the new report, All the President's Psychologists. Nathaniel Raymond, can you respond to what Dr. Benke said?
Well, what we now know by reading the American Psychological Association's emails is that Dr. Benke's assertion in 2005 of bring us the facts and we will respond directly contradicts his own words to the Operational Assessment Division of the Central Intelligence Agency in 2004, where he basically says we are not going to investigate in the context of the secret meeting they had almost to the basically to the day that the White House was reauthorizing the enhanced interrogation program. We're not going to investigate any claims of abuse or any charges made at that meeting. That directly contradicts what he said on Democracy Now! Second is his continued assertion that somehow the American Psychiatric Association, which endorsed in 2006 a clear ban on participation in all interrogations, direct participation by psychiatrists, is analogous to the APA position, is entirely specious. The fact of the matter is the American Psychological Association position in that Penn's report that we now know is the direct result of coordination with the intelligence community, and in some cases, elements of that community writing language in the report, critical research language, is entirely different to look at the APA position and the American Psychological Association position for one reason. The American Psychological Association based its policy on U.S. definitions of torture at that time, which we now know from the declassified Office of Legal Counsel memos had an entirely different view of what constituted, quote, torture and what constituted cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. So saying that those positions are the same is just not the facts.
Explain what changed.
What changed is there was two periods of change. The first is immediately after 9/11. We have evidence in the public record that the American Psychological Association changed a large portion of its ethics code related to research. And basically it wrote out international and domestic protections on consent for human subjects research. We know by different names some of those protections, such as the Nuremberg Code and the Common Rule. They allowed for the revocation of consent when consistent with a lawful order or regulation. That then combined with the second set of changes, which is the 2005 Penn's report, the Psychological Ethics and National Security Task Force report, then not only allows but exhorts psychologists to have a research role in not only interrogations, but this is the key sentence, Amy, in determining what constitutes cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment. Now, last time I checked, psychologists were not lawyers. This is outside the professional competency of psychologists to make a legal determination based on research. The question is, Why were they being asked to do that in language that we now know from the emails appears to have been written by a former White House official? The fact of the matter is that's exactly what the Bradbury memos that were then protecting the Bush administration from potential torture charges required. And that's exactly the concern that was being raised by the Office of the Inspector General internally at CIA, we now know from the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. So that one sentence about research into what constitutes cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment positions psychologists to be the legal heat shield for the President of the United States.
Dr. Reisner.
Well, we listened to Dr. Benke say that the APA is opposed to torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment at the very moment when they are writing into our ethics code a policy that permits psychologists' very presence at those sites, researching, overseeing, and monitoring, that the psychologist being there is what makes it fall outside the definition of torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment concocted by the Justice Department in order to legally allow the torture. So what we have is a working together between the psychologists, the American Psychological Association, the CIA, and the White House to create a cover story that says that torture is not torture, that it's not legally torture under these rules. And while Dr. Benke is claiming that psychologists don't torture, psychologists are, in fact, torturing, and the APA seems to know it according to these emails and according to what was in the press. But so what he's doing is he's parsing the facts and funneling it through a bent and distorted APA ethics code that has been changed simply to allow that program to continue.
I want to read another one of the newly disclosed emails. This is from Dr. Jeff Mumford, Director of Science Policy at the APA, to CIA psychologist Dr. Kirk Hubbard, who was then Chief of Operations for the CIA Operational Assessment Division. Dr. Mumford writes, quote, "I thought you and many of those copied here would be interested to know that APA grabbed the bull by the horns and released this Psychological Ethics and National Security Task Force report today, the PENS Task Force. I also wanted to semi-publicly acknowledge your personal contribution in getting this effort off the ground over a year ago. Your views were well represented by very carefully selected task force members," unquote. In another email from 2005, the APA's Dr. Jeff Mumford admitted former White House advisor Susan Brandon, who was then at the National Institute of Mental Health, helped craft language for the PENS report. Mumford wrote, quote, "Susan, serving as an observer," note she has returned to NIMH, at least temporarily, "helped craft some language related to research, and I hope we can take advantage of the reorganization of the National Intelligence Program with its new emphasis on human intelligence to find a welcoming home for more psychological science." Okay, Nathaniel Raymond, talk about who Mumford is. Talk about also the significance of the Susan they are referring to, Susan Brandon, and her position today.
Well, Jeff Mumford, then and now, was executive director and is executive director of science policy at the American Psychological Association. And while he is one of the most prominent officials in these emails, I want to make clear he's not the only one. We also see Rhea Farberman, the spokeswoman who denied any coordination between the APA and the Bush administration in James Risen's New York Times story. We see Steve Benke, and we also see, and this is new to our report, that the Deputy CEO, Michael Honecker, Deputy CEO of APA, was also CC'd on one of the emails about the secret 2004 meeting. Dr. Brandon then was, as you described, at NIMH. She served in a variety of roles.
National Institute of Mental Health.
National Institutes of Mental Health. And she served in a variety of roles in the Department of Defense and elsewhere. But she also had been, during the time of the planning of the 2003 conference that Mitchell and Jessen attended, an APA employee previously. Now she is the chief scientist of the high-value interrogation group at the FBI. And in that role, she is basically the senior interrogation research scientist in the U.S. government. And thus, the high-value interrogation group, which advises the National Security Council at the White House, is the leading interrogation group in the intelligence community. What we've seen in
she's headed it now.
She's headed it right now. And I think that's something that's been missed in the coverage so far, is that this is not just about what happened 5 years ago. It is about a currently serving Obama administration official. And I want to say that Mark Fallon, the former Assistant Deputy Director of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, came out a few days ago calling for an independent prosecutor in these matters, including the issues raised in our report. He is serving as chair of an advisory group to the high-value interrogation group. So I want to make a point here that we have master interrogators, people who are affiliated with the current interrogation group, who are raising real concerns about the allegations in our report and are saying, this isn't old news. This has direct implications for accountability on these matters involving, in this case, a current administration official.
In 2007, psychologist Jean Maria Arrigo stood on the dais before a standing room only crowd at the annual American Psychological Association meeting in California. This came 2 years after she participated in an APA panel known as the PENS Task Force that we've referred to today, that concluded psychologists working in interrogations play a, quote, valuable and ethical role. Dr. Arrigo criticized the findings and makeup of the panel she was on.
6 of the 10 members were highly placed in the Department of Defense as contractors and military officers. For example, one was the commander of all military psychologists. Their positions on 2 key items of controversy in the PENS report were predetermined by their DoD employment, in spite of the apparent ambivalence of some. These key items were A, the permissive definition of torture in U.S. law versus the strict definition in international law, and second, participation of military psychologists in interrogation settings versus non-participation. Those are the 2 principal issues. And because of their employment, they had to decide the way they did.
That was Dr. Jean Arrigo. Talk about the significance of what she was saying. You know, Democracy Now! Was there covering these meetings as the APA even tried to cut down public access to the public parts of the meeting. But Dr. Steve Reisner, she served on the PENS committee.
That's right. She served believing that it was a committee that of interested and knowledgeable psychologists to actually review ethics policy and national security. What she found was that the task force seemed to have a predetermined agenda, that the members of the task force were involved in the very commands that were implicated in the abuse, and that the majority of the conclusions seemed to have already been drawn before they began. It was a guided operation.
She attempted to take notes during the meeting, is that right?
That's right, and she was asked not to, which is totally bizarre for a meeting that is trying to generate a new policy. She was taking notes, she was participating as if it was a regular meeting. It turned out that the meeting was a meeting of, as the emails reveal, carefully selected members. And that email was to Kirk Hubbard. The members were carefully selected in order, it seems, to guarantee what the CIA and the White House needed from that meeting. And that's what Jean Maria realized, and what she's talking about in that on that panel.
She talked about having a meeting for a few hours and then being handed the resolution of the committee.
That's right.
Before she had even weighed in.
That's right. The drafts came fast and furious. This meeting lasted 2.5 days. And then the very final draft, where they added the piece on research, that came between the end of the meeting and just 12, 24 hours later, the final rewritten version was sent to the members for them to just give their okay. It was whirlwind. They were told that this had to go to the Pentagon. It had to go to the White House. It was hurried, and there was very little room for critique.
And Nathaniel Merriman, who do we now know wrote these drafts?
Well, we know from the Penn's listserv and from Jean Maria Arrigo herself and others that Dr. Stephen Banke was responsible for being the keeper of the draft, and during lunch breaks and in the evenings wrote the language in the report. But that's not the whole story. From what we see in the emails, as you mentioned, Dr. Brandon's avowed role by Dr. Mumford in the research piece raises the broader question of who were the observers in the room and how did they get there. What we see from the Penn's listserv, the listserv of this task force that Jean Maria Arrigo has helped the world to see, that listserv shows that Dr. Gerald Kuchar and Dr. Barry Anton, who is the current president right now of the APA, was responsible for approving the observers in the room. We now know that one of those observers was a senior administration official who had never, and still now, never been publicly acknowledged by the APA as having been in the room. So it's not just who was writing the report, who was Dr. Banke, it was who put those other people secretly in the room. And we now know it was Drs. Anton and Kuchar, according to the listserv.
Why were psychologists so important to this whole process? I mean, what was happening with the psychiatrists of the United States? What was happening with other physicians?
This is where it can get complicated sometimes, and I want to try to express this as clearly as possible. In the enhanced interrogation program, you had two roles for health professionals, and these roles were conjoined. Role one was actually designing and implementing the tactics, and that's what James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen did. The second role is this monitoring and indemnification role, to say that we have not crossed this threshold of severe and long-lasting harm. Now, that role changes throughout the program. It begins with U-by-B, making sure that a line hasn't been crossed. But by the time we get
Bybee, now being a federal judge, explain his role.
He was Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel, and John Yoo worked for him in that office, and he was responsible for primarily crafting the first torture memo.
At University of California, Berkeley Law School.
Yes, at Bolt Hall. And now we move forward in time, and so what we can see in these emails is that at the time the APA was really working hard, its engine was going overdrive on these issues between 2004 and 2005, in direct contact with the CIA, you have another process going on, which is the creation of that new legal authorization that we now know George Tenet asked for upon his resignation. And that's what we call the Bradbury Memo. In that memo, there is a significantly changed role for this second group of health professionals, putting Mitchell and Jessen aside, the monitors, the researchers. And it moves from them determining whether you cross the line to determining the line. And to determine the line, that required research. And so we see in the Bradbury memos very clearly, as we documented in the Physicians for Human Rights Report, Experiments in Torture in 2010, is that they were having to look at the effect of the tactics to the whole detainee population over years and determine what the line was, because there was no clinical literature on torture.
Last December, psychologist James Mitchell, who was contracted by the CIA to design its interrogation program, appeared on Fox News to talk about his role in the waterboarding of Abu Zubaydah. He was interviewed by Megyn Kelly.
Zubaydah shut down, and they asked me to come back to the campus, and it was clear to me when I was at the campus, listen to what people were saying, that there was so much pressure about trying to head off this second wave that was coming that they were going to use some kind of physical coercion. And so I've spent a lot of time in the Air Force SEER School, and I see what happens when people sort of make stuff up on the fly. And in the course of the conversations, I said, if you're going to use physical coercion, Not that you should use physical coercion, but if you're going to use physical coercion, then you should use physical coercion that has been demonstrated over 50 years not to produce the kinds of injuries we would like to avoid.
Okay. So were you the one actually conducting the techniques on Abu Zubaydah, or were you in more of a sort of background role?
It depends on when you're talking about. Initially, I was in a background role. Then after he shut down and the enhanced interrogations were approved, I was in an administration role.
Okay. So did you personally waterboard him?
Yes.
We're going to get to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in a minute, but sticking with Abu Zubaydah for now, were all of the methods that were recited in the Senate report employed, like nudity, standing sleep deprivation, the attention grab, the insult slap, were those all used?
The ones you mentioned were used.
The facial grab, the abdominal slap, the kneeling stress position, walling?
Walling was used. The others, if they showed up on the list, they were used. We didn't typically use a lot of those stress positions, and we didn't use any stress positions with Zubaydah because he had an injury.
That's psychologist James Mitchell, who was in the APA from 2001 to 2006, admitting on Fox News that he waterboarded Abu Zubaydah, the prisoner. Dr. Steve Reisner, we are wrapping up right now. Your response to Mitchell?
Well, this is chilling to listen to the description of a psychologist dedicated to the public good and individual well-being, talking about destroying prisoners' mind and body. And it was chilling to the medical professionals in the CIA who were pushing back. It was chilling to the Inspector General who was pushing back. The program was shut down. And just at that moment, when the program was shut down, the Office of Legal Counsel, the White House, some members of the CIA, and the American Psychological Association appear to have all worked together to revive that program and to find the rationale for psychologists to be able to help that program continue.
So what are you looking for now? What is the next step that's taking place right now with the American Psychological Association, Nathaniel?
Well, as we heard from Senator Feinstein when James Risen's article came out last week, there's clear congressional interest in what happens next. And she said in her statement that she is looking forward to the results of the Hoffman investigation, the independent review of alleged collusion between... Now,
is this independent? He has been hired by the American Psychological Association?
It is called by the APA, the independent review. Dr. Reisner and I and our co-authors have met extensively with David Hoffman, and obviously the proof will be in the pudding when the report is released. But right now, the next step...
Did the APA say they will release the report?
Well, this is a big issue, Amy, is the APA has said that the board will review it, and after it reviews it, will release it. And as we've been calling for, they need to release it to the public right now. When you have Senator Feinstein saying she wants to see this report, there cannot be a half step before it goes to the public. The key issue now is to put pressure on the American Psychological Association to release the report to the public as soon as it is completed.
Your response to what Kirk Hubbard said, the former CIA psychologist, who in a 2012 interview with the Constitution Project's Task Force on Detainee Treatment said that detainees are not patients, nor are they being treated by the psychologists. Therefore, the ethical guidelines for clinicians do not apply, in my opinion. Psychologists can play many different roles and should not be forced into a narrow doctor-patient role.
The Declaration of Helsinki, the Declaration of Tokyo, the Nuremberg Code, U.S. law, the Geneva Conventions are not based on whether someone's a patient. It's based on whether someone's a human being. And the fact of the matter is that those codes were mangled and in some cases written out of what the APA did. So the issue is not about doctor-patient relationship here. It is about war crimes, about crimes against humanity, which are not contingent on someone being your patient.
I want to thank you both for being with us, Nathaniel Raymond and Dr. Stephen Reisner, co-authors of the new report, All the President's Psychologists. We will link to it at democracynow.org.